We're talking about we're talking about building and maintaining fair lease agreements. If you're unfamiliar with farm commons, our mission is to empower agricultural communities to address their own legal vulnerabilities within an ecosystem of support. So what that looks like day to day is educational resources. We write guides, host workshops, do webinars like this one. We also have a podcast and answer folks' questions. At the same time, we deeply believe that the best solutions to farm law come from farmers themselves. And so we do leadership development in communities across our country to ensure that farmers are telling their own stories about the solutions that they've come up with to address legal challenges. We are a membership organization as well. Now, for me personally, my name is Rachel Armstrong, and I live in Duluth, Minnesota. This is where my family has lived for, I think, 5 generations, and goes way back from farming in the cutover areas after the logging companies came through this part of our country and farmed potatoes, cabbage, things like that. Later on, at a dairy farm. There is no more farm today, though. This is not the most viable farming community that one might find. However, once you're bitten by the farm bug, it doesn't leave easily. And farming is what I've always been interested in. I founded Farm Commons because I believe that you deserve legal information so that you can develop resilience that's consistent with your values. You can use this information to make choices about what is going to work for you on your farm. And what I can do is give you practical legal information about how these things tend to work and where the best opportunities are to develop resilience for you as a producer. So before we get started, I can see the chat box and I would love to hear from you. Do you now or have you ever leased farmland, either as a tenant or as a landlord? Feel free to write into the chat box your answer to that question. It might be yes, you've leased either as a tenant or landlord, or no, or sometimes folks are unsure. Folks might be unsure because sometimes it can be hard to tell. Was that actually a lease relationship or was it something else? So where are you at? If you have a chance, put that in the chat box. Now, if you don't, or if you're not in a position to write in the chat box, I can share with you that about half of farmers across America do lease land. Now, those aren't the numbers for who leases out land, who serves as landlord, but I suspect it is quite similar. So most farmers across our country lease land at some point in their farming career. And I suspect that folks in our webinar here today also have been in leasing relationships. Now, you might be in this webinar because you're wondering, did I do it in the most legally resilient way? Was there a better way that I could go about my leasing relationship? No matter where you're at in your journey, I'm sure you have learned a thing or two about leasing, and your knowledge and experience is important too. I'd love to hear at the end some of your tidbits about what has worked for you in leasing as well. All right. Thinking about farmland leasing isn't always the first thing farmers want to do when they wake up in the morning. Usually that's actually farm. But there can be great opportunity in paying attention to the details of our relationship to each other and to this detail to the land that we farm on. Another good reason to do it is that things can get scary. Most farmers who rent are in a tricky position. According to the internal surveys that we have done, about 51% of farmers are vulnerable to losing their lease within a year. Now, the legal reasons why so many farmers are at risk of losing their lease within a year is a combination of two things. Number one, their leases being not in writing. Their leases are verbal. And number two, they might have been in writing at one time, but now they're being renewed verbally year over year. Like, hey, are we good this year? We good to do the same thing? That would be a verbal renewal of the lease. Not to worry though, although so many farming communities do experience this vulnerability, we can fix it. And we can address our vulnerability around leasing without necessarily paying a ton of money to an attorney or acquiring detailed legal knowledge. There are things that folks with no law degree and not a lot of financial resources can do to create a more resilient legal situation in terms of leasing land. And that's what my goal is today, is to show you why you can do this and to show you how you can do this. Now, hopefully the goal is that you can, rest next to the watering can like this happy piggo and at least put the issue of leases to rest and move on to all the other risks that farmers need to manage. All right, so I like to get going with a story, and I've got one for you today. So this story involves Farmer Sam, not his real name. Sam was growing seed garlic on leased land, and he was doing this in order to raise money year over year for a down payment on his own vegetable farm. So one fall, he put his seed garlic in the ground. It was $30,000 worth of seed garlic, and he was getting ready to harvest it the following summer. He was hopeful that this might be the last time that he had to grow this crop on leased land, because he would have enough money for his down payment. Then what happened is later in November, Farmer Sam got a call from the landlord. The landlord was in the process of selling the property and wanted to let Sam know that the lease wasn't going to be renewed for the coming year. Sam panicked, understandably. He was extremely concerned that he was going to be left without any access to the land or the incredibly valuable crop that he had planted a month ago. So in the midst of his panicking, he called Farm Commons. He needed answers to this question, and the way he phrased it is, Rachel, what is the law going to say is fair in this situation? And that's a very rational question to ask. Hey, I'm in this horrible situation. I want to know what the law is going to see as fair. But reality is a little bit different. The first question that I had for Sam in that situation was, okay, Sam, can you tell me, what did you and the landlord agree to do as to when and how this lease was going to renew from year to year? What did you guys agree upon? And what did you think Sam said when I asked that question? If you said, Sam and the landlord didn't talk about it at all, you're right. That's exactly it. Sam and the landowner hadn't agreed to anything. They didn't talk about renewal as a thing like, hey, Sam, let's talk about renewal. It just didn't come up. Sam had been using this land for 4 years, and each year they just did the same thing that they did previously. Maybe they talked about rent and whether or not it would increase, but it was just understood that this would continue until it didn't continue. So what's surprising to many farmers about this story is that the first authority for what is fair in this situation is not state law. It is not statutes and regulations. This is an agreement between two business people about business. And in that situation, the agreement between two business people is what the law wants to honor first and foremost. So the question I asked is the first question that a court would ask if this situation came in front of it. What did you both agree to do when it came time for renewal? The court only wants to turn to state law, case law, and those sorts of things when the people involved did not come up with their own agreement. And that does happen to be exactly what happened here. Sam and the landlord didn't have their own agreement for how and when to let the other person know that they wanted to move on. It would not be repeating this relationship for another year. So that means that in Sam's case, he did have to turn to state law to figure out what to do when he doesn't have his own plan. Now, the bad news for Sam is that these kinds of default state laws that talk about, what happens if you put your property on another person's property, and then the lease ends, blah blah blah. They're not written for garlic producers. Even if there are state laws that do address crops specifically, garlic is an outlier. This is a crop you plant in fall time, and that's not normal. So it's hard to expect that state law is going to accommodate Sam's unique needs in this instance, even if it does address crops specifically. So Sam did not have a lot of ground to stand on in terms of keeping access to his garlic crop. So it's an important story to know about because it turns out badly for the farmer, but it can also have a silver lining for you. You can learn from Sam that farmers and landowners have power. You have power. Whether you are leasing out the land or leasing the land for your farm operation, you have the power to create agreements that suit your operation. And you can see that lease agreement protected in court. The thing is, you have to take the time to craft the solutions that are right for your unique relationship. And then the law will be there to back you up. So one of the key things I want you to learn from this is that state law serves as a backstop for when farm tenants and landlords don't come up with their own agreement. And I need to pause right now and reiterate that we are talking about businesses under a commercial agreement. I am not talking about residential tenant relationships. That is where you have a person and their roommates or a family that's renting a house to live in. That is not a commercial transaction. That is a residential transaction. So again, in commercial instances, farmer and person who owns the farmland to lease to the farmer, state law is a backstop. It fills in for when these two business owners did not come up with their own agreement. So in this way, state law really reacts to bad things. It responds after things have gone wrong to figure out what we should do going forward. To put it another way, if you don't have a plan, the state has one for you, but you might not like it. And it's going to be a generic plan that's designed to work in a wide variety of instances. So one of the positive parts of this is that knowing more laws isn't necessarily what's going to make us more resilient. And I see that that's positive because, I assume that you're in farming because you want to farm, not because you want to go out there and learn a bunch of laws. If you wanted that, you'd have probably gone to law school. So I'm here to assure you that you don't need to make this your part-time job. You don't need to go out and learn a bunch of laws. You need to prevent bad things from ever happening. You need to put yourself in a position where you don't even need to know what state law is because you figured it out in advance. You put a plan in place that memorializes what you want from this relationship, whether you are the tenant or the landowner. And so how do we do that? How do we come up with what we want? We do what Sam and the landowner did not do. We talk. The real truth is that the path to resilience in farmland leasing really is built on relationships. Both of these businesses are most resilient when they proactively decide what is best for them, because these are the only two people who know what is best for them. Detailed conversations are what is going to lead us to a plan. And by that I mean the lease. So this can be a relief. You can talk, you have what you need in order to move forward on a lease that is right for you. Okay, so at this point, a lot of people are saying, okay, sounds good. We already talked about the rental rate. We've had that conversation and we have come up with a rental rate. So what else do you want us to talk about? Well, there is more. Let us talk about what we should talk about. Okay, let's talk about these things. Who is leasing the land? Where is the land? And when does the lease begin? Nothing too fancy there, but let's get a little deeper. Are there limitations on the premises use? Now, presumably, because you're in a webinar about farmland leasing, this lease is going to allow agriculture. But we should probably use a few more words there. When we say agriculture, do we mean on-farm sales? If I can grow the crop there, well, can I sell it there? What about offering tours? And, what about like a pasture walk on the weekend? What about if I want to, host a lambing festival, or I want to have something larger scale? Can I camp on the property? Can I let my friends camp on the property? And when we say agriculture, do we mean animals? And if I can have animals, then can I also slaughter them? And if I can slaughter them, can I also dispose of the carcasses on the property? Assuming, of course, I'm abiding by all state and local regulations. So even just saying you can do agriculture on this parcel comes with a lot of other things that we should be talking about what exactly is allowed. Do we have access to infrastructure? What's the electrical service to the property? What kind of electrical burden can it support, load? The trash. Somebody can come to pick it up. Do I have to do that? Can I store my things on the property? And when I say things, what about my rototiller? And if I could store my rototiller, can I store my fuel for that rototiller? And what kinds of containers can I store the fuel in? Irrigation is a huge one. We got it? How much? And then, even after we talk about what we have access to and when we can use it, then we got to talk about what happens if those resources are reduced or damaged. All of a sudden, the water level drops, and we don't have the irrigation we did before. A storm comes through, or the wiring, breaks. Who is responsible to fix or restore them? And if they are not fixed or restored, do we get a discount on the rental rate? Who can make improvements to the property? Can the farmer make improvements? And generally, this means things like making repairs to buildings, repairs or new fences, and the hoop house scenarios, of course. Now, oftentimes, landowners are happy to allow improvements to be made, of course, and improve stuff. But the more particular question is, all right, so when this relationship ends, is there going to be any compensation for those costs and the increased benefit to the land of those improvements? Now, very often what happens when folks don't talk about this beforehand is the farmer, the one who's using the land, says, look, you pay for the supplies and I'll do all the labor. And that seems like a good deal until the landlord ends the relationship 6 months later and the farmer put in 120 hours of work on that and now doesn't get to reap the benefits of having made that investment. And in that case, the farmer is like, okay, I'd like to bill you $20 an hour for those 120 hours since you terminated this relationship. Good to talk about that one beforehand. And there's more. When does this relationship end? And can we renew this relationship? And of course, that's what happened to Sam and the fellow who owned the property he was on. That's what they didn't discuss. What we should be talking about is, when do we talk about renewal? How do we talk about it? Is a text good enough? If I just shoot you a text and I'm like, hey, same rental rate next year, we're all good. And if we don't want to renew, when do we need to tell someone that? Can we terminate this relationship early? And what does that look like? How do we resolve issues? That one is really important, I think often overlooked, because we assume, well, geez, I went through so many hours to craft this lease. Surely we covered everything, right? There's always something we didn't think about. So it can be really helpful to create another strategy for how to resolve the issues we aren't thinking about. Folks have all kinds of creative ideas for resolving issues. Some of them are more conventional, like, well, we'll use a mediator. But others can be newer, like, well, let's put together a dispute resolution team. And let's have on that team, an extension agent, a clergy person, and a fellow farmer. And we're going to convene that team and explain to them whatever problem it is that develops and ask them to make a recommendation to us. You can write that into your lease if that seems like a good idea to you. And last but not least, of course, what are our payment terms? How much? When? How do we pay? Can I pay in bacon? Does it have to be US dollars? What if it's late? So these are good general terms that everybody needs to consider, but animal and especially crop operations, no matter what it is you're doing in particular, might come with more. So for animal operations, well, what animals? And even if we say, well, cows, well, okay, is there limitations on species, breed, number of head, number of bulls? Stocking limitations for grazed areas, gates, fence repair and maintenance, proof of vaccination, and a bunch of other, regs that might come with this. What about animals that get out a lot? Can we evict them? And if we've got animals, well, what about ATVs, horses, and trucks on the property that might be there to load or provide veterinary care, those sorts of things. Specialty crop operations provide their own issues. Planting perennials, woody stock, planting things that some folks might see as weedy. Are these allowed? What about irrigation? We really got to dig in deep there and figure out where it is, but that's not the only water issue. What about washing for water? I'm sorry, yeah, water for washing. Those have different standards that they need to meet. So where is that, and yeah, where is it coming from? Sometimes we have weed control standards that might need to be incorporated. Same with soil quality, soil nutrients, storage facilities, cold storage, especially like what happens if the cold storage breaks? Whose responsibility is it to fix this? Because that can be really time sensitive. All right, and then sales events and volunteers that might come on the site. Someone might be hosting a CSA, and at the beginning of the leasing relationship, they have a drop-off in town. But then let's say that coffee shop gets into a situation and has to close, and now the farmer needs another drop-off point for 30 CSA shares. Can they come to this farm? Okay, so there's a bunch of things to think through. And at this point, people might be thinking, oh my goodness, this is a lot of talk. I thought this program was about a lease, and I'm pretty sure a lease is a document. What's going on? Or you might be thinking, I am trying to protect myself. I am not trying to have a kumbaya moment with the farmer or the landlord. I don't like chit chat. Not so concerned about their goals. I just want to protect myself. So how are we getting there? How are we getting to that document that I can enforce in court? Good question. That's what we're going to be talking about next. All right, so it may seem like talk is cheap and we're not going anywhere with this, but I think it's not. I'm going to propose to you that this talk is not cheap. And I've got a story to help illustrate that for you. So I've got story A over here. And for here, I've got farmer April and landlord June. So this is a new relationship. They're excited to work together. And April comes to their first meeting with a nice 2-page lease template. She got it from the public library or printed it from the internet. And it covers all the basics. What, when, where, how much money. June reads it. It's only 2 pages, didn't take long. She asks a couple of questions and it all looks good. So they fill in the part about, the rental rate and they sign it. And April sends June a copy. Folks put it in their file cabinets and pat themselves on the back. Not only did they negotiate a lease, they signed it. It's in writing. So that is good. But then on the right-hand side, we have Farmer August and landlord May. Farmer August goes to their first meeting with a bunch of questions. Okay, do you mind if I start harvesting at 4 a.m. on Fridays? I know that's really early, and I do run my refrigerated truck through the morning harvest. So it makes some noise, but that's what keeps my product good for the farmer's market. I need a flow rate of 1 gallon per minute and a pressure of 8 pounds per square inch, and I think I'm going to use 1 acre foot over the course of the season. Can I do that? Takes a long time. August and May meet 3 more times to talk through all of these issues. But through that, they get a really good sense of each other's needs and how they communicate. But problem is, by that time, the season is well underway, and they intended to write all this stuff down and sign it, but they just did not get a chance. Now, later on, the summer progresses. And let's say by late July, things are getting a little crazy. Farmer April and August both want to try on-farm sales because every farmer's market day has been rainy. Now, for Farmer April, she never asked about on-farm sales because the lease template she used never mentioned that, didn't bring it up. Farmer August did ask the landlord, and she said on-farm sales were fine, but they didn't get it in writing. Who is more resilient overall? Who do you think, April or August, is going to have more success dealing with the unplanned issue of on-farm sales? Now, for myself, I'm going to guess that in this instance, it might be August. He and May have developed that relationship. They have come to understand each other's needs. August is already going to have a sense of whether May will like this and how to address any concerns she might have because they've had that conversation. Now, Farmer April, she just doesn't know much about June's concerns or whether June is really going to appreciate this need she has. So I'm proposing that even though August never got a lease in writing, he is still in a good position to be successful with his farm. So I leave this idea for you to assess on your own. You know your relationships, and you know the other business owners, the other farmers, the other landowners in your neighborhood. And you can figure out also where your risk is coming from and the best way to address it. I also want to recognize that not everyone shares the same experience when it comes to starting authentic conversations. We are mere humans, and we humans, when we see ourselves in others, we tend to respond with more openness and understanding and trust. If we're approached by someone who reminds us of our grandmother or our son or our nephew, we're more likely to extend trust and be welcoming of their thoughts and ideas. But when we don't have familiarity with the person who approaches us, we don't speak the same language, we don't come from the same place, it can be natural to respond with more suspicion or guardedness. So we want to create farming communities where everyone is welcome. We need more farmers in America and not fewer. And so it's in everyone's interest to create these opportunities of welcoming. So it can be important, it can be helpful to think of that and remember that whether our instincts are asking us to put up a barrier because we aren't familiar with that person. And when we're aware of those barriers, it's easier to take them down. So it's hard enough to be a farmer right now. Let's see if we can make it easier for everyone who wants to take on this amazing and challenging job. Okay, and with that, let's transition to the harsh and horrible fact that bad things still happen. Of course, despite my little rose-colored glasses world where we all talk and come to agreement, things do go wrong. What then? Well, you know it. It's taken me, I don't know, a half hour to get to this point, but we have arrived. Put it in writing. Yes, you should put your lease in writing. Why? Number one, it helps our memories. We often forget what we talked about. What seemed to make perfect sense in April is gone from our memory by October. Also, write it down because it creates more clarity. Sometimes when we're talking together, it's easy to say things like, sure, you can use that part of the pole barn. That part you're already using, I'm fine with that. But then when we go down to actually write, you can use that part of the pole barn you're already using, it makes us think a little bit more. Like, wait, which part of the pole barn are we using? And do we both have the same understanding of the part we're using? So it helps motivate us and to find those ambiguities and be more clear. And number three, yes, write it down so you can enforce it. This is a really important part of the law, is that written leases are much easier to enforce than verbal ones. Now, I put this as the third reason to put your lease in writing because most farmers and landowners and rural citizens overall would much prefer to hate each other forever than to go to court over a lease. So, to some, this is a minor victory. It is the ability to do what we will never choose to do. But it can be important because it really gives confidence. A person feels better when they know that what they put their time and effort towards is enforceable. In most states, a lease that is for more than 1 year is not enforceable unless it is in writing. And there are always exceptions to that rule. So if it happens to you, go see an attorney. But suffice to say, it's a lot better when it's in writing. So how do we do that? How do we write the lease? It's not too hard. First, work on a checklist. Write out the issues you want to include in the lease. Then talk about them with the other side, whether that is the farming individual or the person who owns the land. Just work through it through normal language. And as soon as you have an agreement, write it down. It doesn't have to look fancy. Something that says, Farmer August and Landlord May agree that they will discuss whether to renew the lease for another year around October 1, and they will decide by October 30th if the lease will renew, so that August has enough time to get his garlic crop in. It is expected that if either party does not want to renew the lease, they will tell the other person as soon as they are able, even if it is before October 1. So it doesn't sound horribly legal, right? I mean, you don't have to have a law degree to make a basic statement like that about what folks intend to do. And at the end, then you have a long list of things to which you agree. And that is 95% of the way to a written, enforceable lease agreement. At that point, the work left to be done is rephrasing these as issues and points of agreement into a lease document. You can work with an attorney to do that. And what an attorney is going to be really helpful for at this point is helping you identify any areas where, number one, you might have contradicted yourself, because attorneys are good at finding that kind of thing. But number two, is there anything you did that state law won't uphold, where state law really would supersede that agreement? Because there can be those instances where state law is going to rule above and beyond your agreement. Less common, and certainly most of the points that you would agree on, the law is going to uphold. But an attorney can help you figure out which those are. Other folks do have a trusted template that they really like to use that has worked for them, and certainly that is an option. Then folks usually sign the lease and consider didn't mean to scroll up there, and consider recording it with the county. What that does is put anyone else on notice who later takes control of the land that there is an active enforceable lease agreement on that land. So think of, things like bankruptcy and death. Then the future, successor would know that there's a lease on this property. All right. So writing a lease does not have to be super fancy or start with the words whereas and therefore. It is, at its essence, an agreement, which you can then take to an attorney to guard against internal contradictions or state law overruling it at some point. So from here, you might be thinking of a variety of action steps to build resilience on your operation. Maybe you need to start with having a conversation. Maybe you've realized, there are a lot of things that we should get clear on. Or maybe you have realized, gosh, we're doing really good about a thorough agreement. We just need to put it on paper. Both of those are great action steps to help building your resilience around leases. Now, I've got a little bit of time left, and we will save time for your questions at the end. But still, I've got 10 minutes or so, and I want to make a transition. At this point, I want to talk about another source of problems that come up when we are leasing land. And I will say that this one tends to affect tenants much more than it affects landowners. So, a little bit of a transition there too, where if you're the one who's looking to utilize the land, this is especially important to you. So sometimes it isn't a dispute between farmer and landowner that develops, but just a fundamental issue of incompatibility that happens um, between the farmer and the land. The land or whatever's happening there is just not right for what they need to do. So for there, our action step is to do our due diligence on the land before leasing. Now, I bring this up in our leasing webinars because very often the phrase due diligence is associated with buying farmland. If we're going to buy farmland, then yeah, we're going to do our due diligence. And folks tend to forget that that's still really important when leasing. Leasing can go for a long time. You could have a lease for 10 years if you wanted one. But even if it's just year to year, you don't need to lose a year of your farming career because of incompatibility with the land for some reason or another. So due diligence on leasing is a really important risk management factor and step to consider. So I've got some sad stories, just a couple, because sometimes fear of loss can motivate us to act. So the first one I've got, this involves a beginning farmer. She inherits 30 acres from her uncle. So it is a situation where she owns, but very analogous to leasing. Then she discovers that the land is under a lease for the next 5 years. And she's got to wait 5 years to use those fields. She did not know that. She didn't understand before her uncle passed that this limitation was on those lands, and this threatens her business plan and forces her to keep leasing her own land for 5 more years from someone else. So, could we have prevented this? In another situation, a farmer expands acreage by leasing the neighbor's field from them. But then what happens is the third neighbor on the far side of the property pulls up all the fence lines and moves them 50 yards onto the land that the farmer thought he just had a lease for. And that guy says, no, this is my property. It's always been my property, and now I'm taking it back. Now what? I'm not going to get into who's right and who's wrong in these kinds of instances. We don't want to be involved in these conflicts. This stuff gets complicated, it gets expensive, and it gets heartbreaking to disagree with those who are close to us, whether they're our neighbors or our family. And honestly, there isn't always a good guy and a bad guy in these types of situations. Take the first story about the new farmer who discovers that the tenant has a 5-year lease. Is it bad? It's not bad for the farmer who negotiated and received that 5-year lease. It's bad she didn't know about it. So most of these stories, there's really 2 sides to it. And so that's not our point. Our point is to avoid these sorts of things and to gain knowledge. What we really, all we needed to know was that this was the case. We want to know if a lease exists on the property. We want to know if there is a potential dispute about a boundary line or some lack of clarity about where it is. We want to know if a utility company has a right to dig up the property. They might well show up with bulldozers tomorrow. We want to know if the zoning code says that we can or cannot host a farm event on that site. And we want to know before we sign the lease. So with this information, we can make important choices about our farm. We can choose to pay a lesser amount for that lease because now this property simply makes us more vulnerable. Even if we do go forward with the lease, we can choose to vote for specific zoning board candidates or try to do a public awareness campaign about something that is bothering us. What you need is information, and from there you can choose the action steps that are right for you. So, like I said, a lot of this affects the rental rate that you're going to be willing to pay, but you have more ways that you can use this knowledge. So, this process of discovering the legal character of the land and figuring out what its mechanics are is called due diligence. That's a fine phrase, but it's really awkward when you're saying due diligence. But, anyways, there are different kinds of dues. DUE is this one. So it's really boring. It's just a very logistical process of pawing through to figure out what's happening on this land. Here are some things that I propose you start out looking for when you start on your due diligence adventure. Number one, pay attention to property lines. Where do people think they are? Where might they be in reality? Number two, are other people already using this land? So when I say, well, we'll get to that. And number three, does anyone else have the right to use the land, even if they aren't using that right now? So going more in depth around property lines, one of the things you will hear about, of course, to solve this is to get a survey. However, if you have looked at the price for a survey, probably wondering if that's really a fair option. When budgets are tight, many people are not going to be in a position, especially if they're just considering leasing this land and not buying it. That's not really going to happen. But I do want to put it out there that that is a most surefire way to determine where your property lines are. There are other steps you can take that are free to low cost. Go to the county land records office and look for any documents there that might include a more modern map or survey. It could be that a survey was done for another purpose that was then logged with the county land records office, and you could use that to see if it's there. Absolutely walk the property and look for any property markers or monuments that would help you understand where the property line is. Now, a lot of folks look for fences, but do know that fences may have been built in the wrong place. Property markers and monuments are a much more secure way to try to discern where the boundaries of properties are. Of course, they're also a lot harder to see, all grown over, and you know how that is. So other things you can do is ask around. Where do folks believe the boundary is located? And I bring this up especially because, if you're just assuming that the fence is the boundary line, ask. And ask more than one person if that is, in fact, where they believe the boundary is. Ask around to see if anyone has heard of confusion or disagreement about the boundary lines, something that's present or something that happened in the past. Does anyone else know where the markers or monuments are located for property lines? And even if a survey was not logged with the county land records office, somebody may have done one recently and would share the results with you. So these are some lower cost, more accessible steps that you can take to try to determine if you might end up with a property line issue. And I also want to offer a little reality check that sometimes you go to all that work and you don't learn anything. People are like, I don't know, the fence. No, I've never looked for the monuments. Well, that's part of what happens with due diligence. You go through the process and you don't know what you're going to get. But does that mean you've wasted your time? No, not necessarily. What you know now is that you don't know. And that information is still important for risk management. In that situation, you can go forward knowing that you cannot be certain. If the property line is off by 50 yards, how will that affect your operation? Is it going to hurt your profitability, your quality of life? And can you handle that risk? Can you mitigate that risk in other ways? And if you can't, if the situation is tight enough that none of those are tolerable, you might need to, move on to other land or find the money for the survey. So this is an important reality check for all stages of due diligence. Sometimes we didn't get clear answers, and now we have to act within uncertainty. Okay, are other people using the property? Seems obvious, like why would you lease out property someone else is already using? but it does happen. And my hunting stand is Exhibit A. Sometimes when we mean using the property, we don't mean, well, they're cropping it. We mean, well, they're using it for recreation, for farming, for access. Make sure you know where and how others also have a right to use that property. And again, you're going to use that to figure out, well, is this compatible with what I want to do? Is this going to shape what I will pay for this property under a lease arrangement? So walk the land. Even if you can't speak directly with whoever might have extended that right to hunt the land, you might see hunting shacks or see signs that others are using it. I can't say enough how much you can learn by walking the land. And of course, talk to the neighbors and the current owner, that's not you, about who uses the land. Have they noticed people coming and going? So it seems obvious, but a lot of people do miss certain things when they are walking the land. They see a hunting stand, but don't think a little further about it. They might see garbage, but not make that connection like, well, does this mean someone is using this land? What you see, ask about, and try to find more information about what is really happening here. So, if you were to ask the landowner, hey, what about that garbage dump in the back? Was that used for chemicals, or was that just wood scraps? What's going on? It's very possible the landowner has no idea that there is a dump back there and that it's been the neighbor who's been dumping that waste for 10 years. So, that's really important for everyone to be able to find out. And now you get to decide if you want to buy the property that's potentially contaminated if it was chemicals that were dumped. Okay. And of course, if you're in the middle of the property and you're standing in a field of soybeans, who is it that is leasing the land and how long does that lease last? Your job is to manage the risk. Look and ask and manage your risk accordingly. Don't forget about your easements and rights of way. You may be looking at a piece of property, but if you aren't assessing how much of that is vulnerable to easements and rights of ways, you might actually be looking at less land than you thought. Easements are easier to assess when you're like, I see a power pole. Yes, the power company usually has an easement to maintain that. This is harder to see when what we are talking about is subsurface mineral rights, fracking rights, things like that, rights to extract the sand. You might not know that that is there until someone wants to exercise that right, and it's right underneath your field. For these, check the property record, go to the County Land Records Office, and consult the records for the parcel in question. It's not always easy to read, but a really valuable step. Okay, that's a bunch of good stuff. We're right at time for 10 minutes left for questions. Right before we get to those, I'm going to let you know that we do have a bunch of other documents to help support you in crafting lease agreements. We've got a workbook for farmers to use. We have long-term lease agreements with templates because leases of 5 to 50 years do get more complicated. And of course, more on the due diligence required for an agricultural parcel. So we've got all kinds of good stuff as well as workshops and classes that you can take at Farm Commons. But now we'll get to your questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Rachel. You're really, really enlightening and great presentation. I do see one question in the chat, but as a quick reminder that if you do have any questions for Rachel, go ahead and type them into the chat. The chat box is at the bottom of your screen. The first question we have, I don't know what this is abbreviating, so I am sorry. I think it means average. What is the average fee for an attorney, and what are the resources for sourcing regional agricultural lease lawyers and legal assistance?
Yeah, that's a good question. Legal fees can vary quite a bit depending on two things. Number one, how new is this attorney? How much experience do they have? And second, geography. Attorneys who are in cities and larger towns tend to be more expensive than those that are located in rural areas. A very affordable rate for an attorney could be as low as $250. If you're in a big town, I wouldn't be surprised if you charge $500 an hour for an attorney's services. So it can vary a lot. Um, Business legal services are considered just a cost of running a business, and so it's a very difficult to find assistance for that. That's like free services. However, some of them do exist, from things like transactional clinics at law schools, agricultural law clinics that might pop up. So check and see if there's anything statewide. Those would more often be for assistance.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I have one says, my farmer, I'm assuming the tenant, has built an access road to an 80-acre piece of land. How should I determine cost for maintaining this road since it's subject to erosion?
Oof. Oh boy, there's a lot going on there. There wouldn't be a simple as I think the asker of the question has figured out, that is not a simple scenario, because we'd have to look at, well, who paid for its installation in the first place, both labor and supplies. Who's using the road? Does the road add to the value of the property overall, or does it actually take away from the value of the property? Hopefully, this whole thing was permitted, and as it should be. But if it wasn't, are we now vulnerable to some enforcement actions because it wasn't done in compliance? There are so many factors to figure out on what's fair for a cost like that. Ideally, this is something that we would talk about beforehand when we're contemplating letting someone install an access road. We would say, okay, so this is the permitting process. You're going to do that, right? And number two, what kind of standards are you going to be using in order to make sure that this access road is good and enhances the property? And then some verification of were those standards followed. And then, hey, how are we going to be maintaining this over time? It's always easier to talk about it beforehand. Easy for me to say, of course.
All right. Just to follow up on the question you asked, they say that we share the cost, but I'm wondering about future maintenance.
You can come up with whatever agreement works for you. And I know a lot of times folks are like, well, but what did other people do? It's really hard for an attorney to say, well, what do other people do, because people's circumstances all vary. And so all I'm saying is that legally there's no limit to you coming up with what works for you. And that's a process that shouldn't be shortcutted.
All right. Then I've got one that's asking about hunting near leased land, as in, are they allowed to, I guess, be shooting in the direction of the leased land? This comes as the tenant's worries about risk for domestic animals.
Okay, so if someone has permission to hunt on a piece of property, and that can be extended in all kinds of ways, like you can have a lease for hunting, or you could be on public land where hunting is allowed. Like, people are, allowed to hunt in any number of ways. Now, an animal that is wounded, like a deer, it runs for a little bit before it dies. And so that's a thing that can happen that the animal ran before it died isn't necessarily in conflict with that they were allowed to hunt on that land, even if the animal runs off that parcel. That's, if they didn't do anything negligent about that, if that's just what happens when people hunt, then that's not a problem. Now, but what they might be meaning is, well, if they're shooting their bullets off the property and it's a hazard, I mean, anyone can get in trouble for being reckless with their firearm, no matter where they are or whether they do or don't have permission to be there. You can't be reckless with the firearm. And so someone who's shooting in a way that creates a hazard for someone else, well, they can get in trouble for that, lease or no lease, boundary line or no boundary line. So I would say that's not a leasing issue. That's an issue of firearm responsibility and not creating that danger. Which if they are creating danger, they could get in trouble under any number of different laws that would come to bear on how we handle firearms. So I hope that sheds some light on it.
All right, I think we have time for just one or two more. Who typically pays for permanent improvements, such as a winter watering system or a permanent fence? Is it the renter or the owner?
Yeah. So you can figure out that I kind of don't answer questions on who typically pays for. And because I want to reinforce for you that you get to decide whatever works for you. And individual circumstances can vary wildly depending on size of operation, level of profitability, time of experience, access to the thing. Most of the time people are asking because it's hard to come up with our own solution, but I don't want to shortcut that process for you. You've got to come up with your own solution. It can help to start very locally and ask a neighbor, because sometimes even local culture comes to bear on these things. So I would start within your community if you're looking for ideas on these things. And if you don't know, you can start up the conversation with the landlord or the tenant and say, what seems fair to you in this circumstance? I think very often that we approach leases and leasing relationships from a power-based perspective. Well, I don't want to look like I don't know. I don't want to look like I don't have a plan, because that makes me look vulnerable. But I am proposing that that it doesn't have to create vulnerability to open up that conversation, that it can actually create more strength and develop a more resilient relationship over time, because we've had that sometimes when we push paper or answers at people like, I've got it figured out, you can sign or you can walk, that doesn't promote the kind of resilience we actually need over time. So the world is your oyster. You can have it the way you want it with your lease, as long as you just agree to it.
All right. Thank you so much. With that, it is 1 o'clock. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And there was some great questions, great presentation overall. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.